Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. Welcome, 30 September, dis and dat information. We're continuing on with Saints de Cecilia's subsumption chapter 1. And we should be somewhere. Oh, okie dokie. I think, because I can't remember, of course, where we left off. Righto. All righty. We'll start at 2.2. From pure concepts to dialectical categories. As we've seen, Kant believed formal logic to be devoid of specific content, merely describing the empty functions of thought as such, yet when transcendentally adapting to the form of intuition as pure concepts of the understanding, such functions came to constitute the a priori structure of all objective experience. In this adapted form, the concepts enumerated traditional metaphysical categories such as quality, quantity, relation, etc. Transcendental logic was the product of this logicization of metaphysical concepts, which displaced those determinations of the object to the subject structure itself, and then reintroduced them into the cognized object via the subsumptive operation. Hegel was broadly in accord with the necessity of such internalization and the explication of a subjectively mediated structure of objectivity. Concerning Kant's transcendental deduction of the subject structure of consciousness, however, Hegel claimed that the specific thought determinations, the categories of the understanding, which specify the modes of organizing and relating the determinations of the object to the unity of the I, were, firstly, not the product of an immanent derivation. He accused Kant of naively appropriating the formal logic on which they were based from ordinary logic, a largely unmodified Aristotelian theory of judgments, and secondly, attenuated by their epistemologically restricted validity, footnote 105. First of all, the critical philosophy, quote, first of all, the critical philosophy subjects to investigation the validity of the concepts of the understanding that are used in metaphysics, but also in the other sciences and in ordinary representation. This critique does not involve itself with the content, however, or with the determinate mutual relationship of these thought determinations to each other. Instead, it considers them according to the antithesis of subjectivity and objectivity in general. The more detailed forms of the a priori, i.e., of thinking, which in spite of its objectivity is interpreted as a merely subjective activity, are presented in a systematic order, which, it may be remarked, rests only upon psychological historical foundations. Footnote 106. Now, because the interest of the Kantian philosophy was directed to the so-called transcendental aspect of the categories, it treated them in such a way as to reveal nothing about what they were in themselves, what they are in themselves, what categories are without the abstract relation to the ego common to all, and wherein their specific nature relatively to each other and to the relationship and their relationship to each other consists. That is, such questions were not an object of consideration, footnote 107, close quote. Continuing the efforts of his Jena system, Hegel proposes in The Science of Logic to undertake a complete reconstruction of the categories of pure thought. One of the central premises of this project is the rejection of Kant's initially logical distinction between the form and the content of thinking, the form of thinking and the content of thinking, an assumption that is problematically reproduced at the level of the relation of concepts and intuition, giving rise to the need for transcendental subsumption in order to establish their correspondence. Instead, Hegel proposes to take the categories of thought as simultaneously providing the content of a scientific inquiry and the form of a scientific inquiry into thinking. That is, quote, it's quite inept to say that logic abstracts from all content, that it teaches only the rules of thinking without any reference to what is being thought or without being able to consider its nature. As for thinking and the rules of thinking are supposed to be the subject matter of logic, these directly constitute its particular content or peculiar content. Far from objective thinking being formal, far from it standing in need of a matter to constitute an actual and true cognition, it is its content alone which has absolute truth. Or, if one still wanted to employ the word matter, it is the veritable matter, but a matter which is not external to the form, since this matter is rather pure thought, and hence the absolute form itself. Footnote 108. By asserting the identity of the form of thought and the content of thought within a single self-developing process, whose method is also not to be indistinguishable from its matter, Hegel was able to claim that his exposition constituted a systematic derivation, i.e., one in which each determination emerges immanently from the dialectical critique and determinate negation of the previous. This is something that Kant never achieved, instead articulating his categories in parallel to each other. Furthermore, Hegel would claim that the results of this process, rather than being mere subjective forms of thought pertaining to individual consciousness in its opposition to the object, have objective validity, insofar as the determinations of logic are actual moments of a reality far more concrete than the sensory show of empirical experience. Thus, the science of logic, in dealing with the thought determinations, which in general run through our mind instinctively and unconsciously, will also be a reconstruction of those which are singled out by reflection and are fixed by it as subjective forms external to the matter and import of the determinations of thought. Footnote 109. All such lifeless determinations of the understanding, which had been reduced by the logic of the time to analytical, mechanical, that is, concept-less, conceptless, griftless, irrational procedures are in Hegel's logic enfolded within the systematic sequence of logical forms in their imminent development. It is by virtue of the speculative identity of concepts and the concept, big C concept, that critical philosophy's antithesis between the limited abstract universality of the conceptual content of thought and the distributed universality of its external ground in individual consciousness is dissolved. Quote, the antithesis between form and content, which is given special validity when the concept is supposed to be what is only formal, now lies behind us, together with all the other antitheses that reflection keeps fixed. They have been overcome dialectically, i.e., through themselves, and it is precisely the concept, big C concept, that contains all the earlier determinations of thinking sublated within itself. Certainly the concept must be considered as a form, but it is a form that is infinite and creative, one that both encloses the plenitude of all content within itself and, at the same time, releases it from itself. Footnote 110. The second essential modification of subsumption that we find in Hegel's philosophy is therefore the idea that those determinations of the object through which subsumption might occur can only be understood in the fullness of their truth by grasping their place and actuality within the systematic totality of determinations in which externality and synthesis are sublated in the course of the organic development of mediating conditions. These two aspects of Hegel's critique of Kant therefore articulate the unity of the processual subjective totality and with it the function and implications of subsumption on an entirely new conceptual plane. On one hand, it is the development of the process as a whole that gives unity and meaning to the various moments of its existence. On the other hand, the categories themselves, in their dialectical interrelation and development out of one another, are precisely what constitutes the determinate moments of the process. In this way, the basic Kantian structure of apperceptions has been retained, but the scope of the eye and its moments have been both expanded and given a higher degree of conceptual coherence. An important question arises at this point, namely how subsumption fits within the general movement of the big C concept as both a constitutive feature of the movement as such and simultaneously as a part of one of its determinate stages or moments, which as a partial and thus inadequate moment will be abolished in the course of its development. Is this a repeat of the tension between synthesis and subsumption we found in Kant, i.e. of that between process and act? And is this tension resolved in Hegel's speculative repositioning of subsumption at a specific moment in the exposition of the concept as whole? 2.3, subsumption's place in the exposition. A consequence of Hegel's speculative refounding of logic is that subsumption, like any other logical determination, cannot simply be grasped as an abstractly self-sufficient conceptual relation that is applied to a content independent of it. Instead, its truth and meaning must be established by virtue of its place within the concrete totality. Subsumption's conceptual determinacy therefore emerges at the stage in the concept's self-development at which it is posited, although it should be noted that it's not for Hegel a logical category proper in the way that quality, ground, or the judgment are. Hegel's discussion of subsumption arises in the subjective logic, i.e. that part of the logic which deals not with the ontological determinations of objects, but with the forms of subjective thinking taken at the same time as the concept's own object. Now, such forms broadly correspond to the traditional entities of logic, that is, the concept, judgment, and syllogism, thus it originally gave rise to the problem of subsumption from Aristotle onward, and notably in Kant. The treatment of these forms emerges in the logic once the essential determinations of the object have been developed to their highest form as substance, but the subjective side of thinking that grasps such determinations remains only implicit, such that the antithesis between concepts and the big C concept, what for Kant would correspond to understanding and reason, has not been overcome, even if it has been methodologically alluded to. So, this is what the doctrine of the concept undertakes to do by developing the various functions of unity which relate the determinations of being with the reflected determinations of essence, leading to the freedom of the concept in its externalization and return to the self, therefore resolving concepts into the concept, big C. Structurally, Hegel's exposition mirrors the Kantian treatment of subsumption in the latter's lecture on formal logic, in that it begins with the immediacy of the concept, then demonstrates its mediation through acts of judgment, and finally places these discrete acts within the syllogistic form that can then be extended to produce chains of inferential or mediated reasoning. However, Hegel's critique of the subjective forms of the concept from the standpoint of his transformed conception of the subject-structure of this, his transformed conception of the subject structure and the systematic derivation of its determinate content provides a new perspective on the conceptual structure, content, and most importantly, the limits of the subsumptive relation. For Hegel, the first shape of the subjective concept is its discreteness as a concept rather than the concept, big C, which in its first mode of appearance is associated with the abstract universality of concepts of the understanding. The concept, big C, in the guise of immediacy constitutes the point of view for which the big C concept is a subjective thinking, a reflection external to the subject matter, footnote 111. Here, the concept is statically self-identical and bears only an external relation to any content which might be contained subsumptively under it. It therefore lacks concreteness. But it is precisely the specific determinacy of its content that contradicts the universality of its form as concept, revealing it to be only a limited form of universality, a particularized universal. Quote, the simple concepts, abstract determinations, are eternal essentialities only in respect of their form, but their content is at variance with this form. Therefore, they are not truth or imperishable. Their content is at variance with the form because it is not determinateness itself as universal. That is, it is not totality of the concepts, big C, difference, or not itself the whole form, but the form of the limited understanding is itself the imperfect form, namely abstract universality, footnote 112. So the simple concept, therefore, splits into two moments, universal and particular. These are diverse and opposed moments of the concept, which, as John Burbridge points out in his commentary to the logic, function as particulars vis-a-vis each other, even though one of the particulars is called the universal, footnote 113. Finally, these two antithetical aspects are united in the singular, that is the Einsein concept, the singular concept, which constitutes the third moment and the unity of the concept as such in all its moments. As the second negation, that is, as negation of the negation, yes, we're there, it is absolute determinateness or singularity and concreteness, footnote 114. A higher form of universality that incorporates these differentiations is thereby posited over and above the initial abstractness of the simple concept. Stay with us. The universality, particularity, and singularity, note these three important moments, which we're now back to, are thus for Hegel the genuine distinctions or types of the big C concept, of the concept. The genuine distinctions or types of the concept, yet to think of them as discrete existences apart from each other is still to grasp them via external reflection, which marks the limit of the singular concept's universality in the sense that the concept as such does not abide within itself without development, as the understanding would have it. On the contrary, being the infinite form, the concept is totally active. Footnote 115. The concept is totally active. Hegel therefore goes on to develop the implicit conditions for the existence of these moments of the concept in their concreteness, which is the activity, remember, process and act, which is the activity of their immanent distinguishing and determining in the judgment, that is, the movement of thought that generates their distinctness and then holds it together. It is in this sense that Hegel asserts, much like Kant, that to judge is to determine the concept. Footnote 116. It is here, in the active articulation of the relations between conceptual determinations, that Hegel's main discussion of subsumption arises. For Hegel, judgment always and necessarily particularizes the concept by explicitly positing the relations between its independent extremes, that is, universal, predicate, and singular, universal and singular, predicate and logico-grammatical subject, each of which is itself already a concept. You can see where this can go to language. It thus develops the concept's own reality out of itself and its own essential determinations. Quote, the judgment can therefore be called the proximate realization of the concept, inasmuch as reality denotes its general entry into existence as a determinate being. Footnote 117. Judgment, and you could ask whether that's a performative, which is another question. Judgment is the concept's actualizing activity, and its significance points beyond the subjective emptiness of its logical formal character. At first, however, it takes the subjective form of an external unity posited between the two concepts that occupy the positions of, yes, subject and predicate. Quote, the judgment has in general for its sides totalities, which to begin with are essentially self-subsistent. The unity of the concept is therefore at first only a relation of self-subsistence, self-subsistence, S-I-S-T-E-N-T-S. From this subjective standpoint, then, subject and predicate are considered to be complete, each on its own account, apart from the other. The subject as an object that would exist even if it did not possess this predicate, the predicate as a universal determination that would exist even if it did not belong to this subject. Footnote 118. There's a lot to read. Thus, while the relating of subject and predicate has been posited explicitly, the relation remains abstract. The judgment is characterized by the antithesis of subsumption and inherence. The judgment is characterized by the antithesis of subsumption and inherence, which mirrors the tension we've already developed between the two universalities of the subject structure, subject-structure, and its determinations. The abstractly universal property inheres, inherence, right? Subsumption and inherence. The abstractly universal property inheres in the subject, whilst the subject is subsumed under the predicate. So I think you can see the mechanical direction this is heading, right? It's not mechanical, but it's the structure of the argument. Since the predicate, quote, since the predicate is thus distinct from the subject, it's only an isolated determinateness of the latter, only one of its properties, while the subject itself is the concrete, the totality of manifold determinateness, just as the predicate contains one, it is the universal. But on the other hand, the predicate too is a self-subsistent universality, and the subject conversely only a determination of it. So, looked at this way, the predicate subsumes the subject. Singularity and particularity are not for themselves, but have their essence and substance in the universal. The predicate expresses the subject in its big C concept. The predicate expresses the subject in its concept. The individual and the particular are contingent determinations in the subject. It is their absolute possibility. When in the case of subsumption, one thinks of an external connection of subject and predicate, and the subject is conceived of as self-subsistent something, the subsumption refers to the subjective act of judgment above, mentioned, in which one starts from the self-subsistence of both subject and predicate. Now, from this standpoint, subsumption is only the application of the universal to a particular or an individual, which is placed under the universal in accordance with a vague idea that it is of inferior quality, footnote 119. It's a lot to unpack there. Now, because of their initially presupposed externality, subject and predicate attain only an abstract, differenceless identity that is posited in the is of the copula. Yet at the same time, this is asserts the supersession of this external relation insofar as it posits an identity of being between the two extremes. Quote, the copula indicates that the predicate belongs to the being of the subject. It is not merely externally combined with it, footnote 120. The contradictory structure of judgment is that it renders explicit both the self-subsistence of the independent extremes and, see this is where the copula comes in, right? And their abstract identity in the copula, whilst their sublating into a higher unity is only implicitly contained in the form as a whole and remains undeveloped. The relation is truly antithetical. That is, on the one hand, the discrete identity of each is constituted by its relation to the other. On the other, their posited identity is undermined by their mutual externality. Each absorbs the other from the standpoint of its own abstract universality. That is, subsumption of the subject under the predicate, inherence of the predicate in the subject, of and in. But at this stage, no standpoint of higher unity that would sublate these oppositions is posited concretely. So, subsumption first arises as one side of the judgment in general, but it is in Hegel's exposition of the judgment of reflection that it emerges as the dominant or characteristic logical shape of the judgment as a whole and is treated in detail. Here, rather than the determination of the predicate as just one of the subject's multiple properties, as was the case in the judgment of existence, it is the subject, rather, that is alterable and waits determination by the predicate, which no longer inheres in the subject. It is rather the implicit being under which this individual is subsumed as an accidental, footnote 121. In these reflective judgments, the predicate unilaterally constitutes the basis by which and in accordance with which the subject is to be measured and determined, so that it receives a concrete identity only as a manifestation of the conceptual richness of the predicate, footnote 122. Now, Hegel goes on to develop these various modes of subsumption of the subject under the predicate, in which the subject develops itself into a progressively universalized form, that is, from the singular judgment, that is, X is Y, to the particular judgment, these or some X's are Y, to the universal judgment, that is, all X's are Y, in which subject and predicate reach apparent equality. Yet even at this developed point, the universality of the relation is only, quote, the external universality of reflection allness. That is, all means all individuals, and in it, the individual remains unchanged. This universality is therefore only a taking together of independently existing individuals. It is the community of a property which only belongs to them in comparison. It is this community that is usually the first thing that occurs to a subjective, unphilosophical thinking when universality is mentioned. It is given as the obvious reason why determination is to be regarded as universal, that it belongs to a number of things. Footnote 123, close quote. The distinction between this allness and the true universality of the concept clearly demonstrates that subsumptive judgment has not overcome the antithesis holding subjectivity and determinateness apart. It is only a one-sided relation in which the subject is the essential appearance of the predicate's implicit universality. This is because both predicate and subject remain abstract extremes. Quote, if the abstract universal, which is the predicate, falls short of constituting a concept, for a concept certainly implies something more, and if, too, a subject of the kind is not yet much more than a grammatical one, how should the judgment possibly contain truth, seeing that either its concept and object do not agree, or it lacks both concept and object? On the contrary, then, what is impossible and absurd is to attempt to grasp the truth in such forms as the positive judgment and the judgment generally. Footnote 124, close quote. This, then, is the constitutive limit of the subsumptive relation for Hegel. That is, its universality is stunted at the point of allness. That is, it can only determine its own being in the subject unilaterally and externally, and has no deeper reach that would establish an explicit unity with that which it subsumes. As Hegel goes on to show, this allness will develop its implicit universality into the genus, that is, the universality which is in its own self a concrete. Footnote 125. The genus holds both the richness of determinations and the ground of unity together, such that it does not inhere in the subject, but it is no longer subsumed in the predicate either. Footnote 126. By rendering explicit the immediate identity of subject and predicate, the very character of the judgment has become objective, and crucially, the antithesis between the poles has been sublated into a diverse unity. Quote, when the predicate is determined to objective universality, it ceases to be subsumed under such a determination of relation or comprehensive reflection. Footnote 127, close quote. Now, it is the copula rather than either of the extremes that constitutes the true universal. At this point, the identity of subject and predicate is rendered explicit, and their difference is dissolved. Quote, subject and predicate are therefore identical. That is, they have coalesced into the copula. This identity is the genus or absolute nature of a thing. Insofar, therefore, as this identity again sunders itself into a judgment, it is the inner nature through which subject and predicate are related to one another, a relation of necessity in which these terms of the judgment are only unessential differences. 128. With this, the antithetical relation between conceptual determinations has been sublated, and the form of the judgment has perished because subject and predicate are in themselves the same content, a content which is now unified in the syllogism. Footnote 129. The subsumptive relation taken as self-subsistent has therefore, in the course of the exposition, been shown by Hegel to only ever determine a limited form of universality which does not properly belong to the subject. Now, this concludes Hegel's critique of subsumption as such, that is, as a logical form, because once the relation of difference between conceptual determinations has resolved itself into a truly universal identity, the relation between universal, particular and singular is no longer subsumptive. That is, each moment is equally universal, and the relation becomes that between universal, universal, and universal. Subsumption, therefore, falls away in the movement from fixed and simple immediacies to the living dynamic totality, which incorporates all of these putatively self-sufficient moments into the whole. 2.4 conclusion. The critical concept of subsumption is first developed by Kant in response to the problem of how distinct cognitive orders and elements can be related and unified in the absence of a self-evident or naturally given taxonomy of species and genera. In his attempt to establish the truth of experience, Kant's critique of apparently self-sufficient forms of objectivity reveals them to be conditioned by a complex series of form-determining processes that synthetically unify the sensibly given manifold according to a dominant order of rational consistency. So, in this critical sense, subsumption expresses a relation of determination or belonging between two essentially heterogeneous elements or orders, a relation that is made possible by their common ground in a unified medium of composition, which at the same time is given consistency only by virtue of the subsumptive judgments that are emerging from this new conception is a kind of reflexive circuit or self-grounding structure, self-grounding structure. A reciprocity between the act of subsumption and its subjective ground or compositional totality. That is, a reciprocity between the act of subsumption and its subjective ground or compositional totality. One direct result of this, which bears on the basic logical scheme of universal, particular, and singular, is of special interest here because it will be crucial for thinking about subsumption in Marx's writings. It is that on this account, there can be no unmediated subsumption of singularity by a universal that stands outside it. Instead, subsumption can only occur through a mediation that has its basis in the unifying structure in which both the singular and the universal are composed. That is, to put it another way, particularity is always a mediated result. Logically, now this suggests that subsumption is better thought of as a syllogistic process rather than a form of judgment. Hegel devotes little explicit discussion to subsumptive relations, and it certainly does not play a central role in his system in the way that it does for Kant. Nonetheless, his engagement with the broader aspects of the problematic laid out above have important consequences for the development of the concept of subsumption, in many respects opening the way for Marx's theorization of it. For Kant, the transcendental subject is a fixed structure of unity within which both concepts and intuitions are composed and can therefore be related subsumptively. Hegel not only recognized the importance of such a unity in which heterogeneous elements could be correlated, but he criticized Kant for not developing it far enough, for not producing a properly philosophical unity at the level of this structure. In the first place, Hegel decries the weakness of the subsumptive synthetic relation, subsumptive-synthetic relation between concepts and intuitions, which for him consists in uniting the two elements of cognition in an external, superficial way. Hegel subsequently takes issue with the relation posited by Kant between concepts of the understanding and the I in which they are grounded. In contrast to Kant, Hegel says that sensible intuition and concepts are forms of a content that remains one and the same. Hegel says that sensible intuition and concepts are forms of a content that remains one and the same. Instead of conceiving of the subjectivity of consciousness as a static aggregation of principles and powers that are unified in a structure of reflexive closure, Hegel attempts to grasp it in the text, the phenomenology, as the dynamic movement of knowing passing through the various stages of its immanent self-development. From this perspective, the basic structure of Kantian subjectivity only represents a partial moment in a larger process, given that for Hegel, no single structure or shape of consciousness taken in isolation can be thought of as the true standpoint of knowledge, but is rather all the stages in the totality of their development which constitute this truth as a unified movement. The reflective closure that defines the relation between form and totality in Kantian philosophy is thereby transformed into a processual concept of subject and totality, which is no longer indifferent to the determinations of universality that it employs, but rather only exists in and as the unity of these determinations. This also indicates a transition from a synchronic set of universals or faculties, a fixed field of categories, to a diachronic sequence. This is where language comes in, right? The diachronic sequence of subjective structures, each with their own set or field that are immanently connected in their dialectical development rather than related through the mediation of their common abstract and fixed grounding. So, what Hegel thus achieves is a new conception of how acts of relational determination, such as subsumption, interact with the structure of unity in which their relata are situated. From the standpoint of this unity, the subsumption of particulars under the universal or universals is not an infinitely self-identical act, but takes on a fundamentally different character and produces vastly different effects depending on the stage of development at which it occurs, while at the same time driving that development onward. Thus, Hegel opens the structure of fixed determinations that define Kantian subjectivity and makes it part of a process of dynamic dialectical development. The act of subsuming some particular under a universal can at any given stage of this process only constitute a partial and limited shape of the whole, meaning that it does not have the same degree of immediate reciprocity as it did in Kant, for whom the whole was grounded in a single structure of determination. The subject of knowledge now represents a developmental rather than simply reflexive or structural unity, not just a closed set of determinations, the only standpoint from which it could be determined as actual. What this means is that the significance and effect of any act of subsumption can only be grasped with reference to its place within the systematic totality of determinations, the only standpoint from which it could be determined as actual. In the book Phenomenology, this processual concept of subjective development results in the supersession of the finite standpoint of an isolated consciousness and the development of the social concept of subjectivity that emerges with the transition from subject-object relations, subject-object relations, through subject-subject, and then subject-substance relations in the various forms of ethical life. Hegel's exposition attempts to demonstrate, in the first place, that interpersonal relations are an implicit condition for the existence of the individual self-consciousness that provides the standpoint of Kant's philosophy. Not only is the subsumption of intuitions under concepts that is so fundamental for Kant thereby demoted to a partial and limited stage in this conceptual development, but the very constitutive limit of knowledge set out by Kant. Individual empirical experience is exploded, to use Adorno's phrase, as consciousness leaves behind it the colorful show of the sensuous here and now. The resulting emergence of social relations as objective structures of spirit generates contradictions at the level of the relation between individual self-consciousnesses, the I, which is subject, and the ensemble within which they are united, the we, that is substance. Subsumptive relations thus appear within structures of spirit as that which binds particular individuals to the universality of the social form they exist within and are constituted by. Now, this is hugely important for Marxist thinking on subsumption, as it lays the foundation for an analysis of processes through which individuals are subsumed under objective structures of sociality which constitute their identities and practices at a collective and individual level. We are no longer dealing with synthetic judgment acts of an individual consciousness, but with the development of relational forms that determine the practical action of, quote unquote, individuals in a collective context. So you can hopefully see where this is moving. Yet, despite the complexity Hegel introduces into the critical concept of subsumption and his demotion of the reflexive closure of apperception underpinning the coherence of Kant's account of determining subsumption, he too introduces a form of theoretical closure which overdetermines the scope of subsumptive relations. Hegel imprisons the relation between conceptuality and objectivity, universality and particularity, the field of categories and the elements to which they give form, within a speculatively totalized developmental series. The full truth of any discrete element, as well as any synchronic shape or configuration of categories within this series, can only be registered with reference to the speculative unity of the process as a whole. Now, this ultimately leads Hegel to criticize entirely correctly the logical relation of subsumption on the basis of its imminently contradictory character and to derive its truth from the dynamic mediation of the syllogism at the apex of the text, the logic. Hegel's logic. But the logical completeness of this derivation and the total series of the system within which it is inscribed endows it as a compositional medium with a self-grounding and self-sufficient quality similar to that of Kant's transcendental subject. Both accounts of subsumption are therefore marked by a theoretical closure of the totality as reflexive closure of the structure or speculative closure of dialectical development, respectively. So you can hopefully see where this is moving, right? This establishes the limit point of the critical philosophical concept of subsumption, given that it is a theoretically bound totality that circumscribes the limits of relation, form, and composition. What remains to be considered are the possibilities and qualities of subsumptive relations whose truth and meaning cannot be determined within a purely theoretical context, hence Marx, right? Okay, that's the end of chapter 1. I know that is seems a little complex, but actually it sort of spells it out. And for me, it spells it out in a reasonable way. That is the move from Kant's more, as you would say, a synchronic sort of approach to Hegel's more diachronic, but that's oversimplifying this set of relations. However, it is a kind of articulation, and whether we call it articulation or not is a different question, but these are useful things. They allow us to see this kind of progression, or at least with De Siciliano, how he really wants to get at this. Chapter 2, Materialism, Social Form, and Reproduction. Quote, vulgar criticism discovers contradictions everywhere. The truly philosophical criticism of the present Constitution does not content itself with showing that it contains contradictions. It explains them, comprehends their genesis, their necessity. It grasps their particular significance. This act of comprehension does not, however, consist, as Hegel thinks, in discovering the determinations of the concepts of logic at every point. It consists in the discovery of the particular logic of the particular logic of the particular object. Footnote 1. This chapter traces the development from a critical-philosophical to a critical-social concept of subsumption through a general reconstruction and extension of what can, in the most general terms, simply be called Marx's materialism. This materialism emerges from Marx's critique of philosophy in both its idealist and traditional materialist variants, right? Recall that there's a lot there, young Hegelians, Feuerbach, etc. Finds its first iteration in his famous 11 Theses on Feuerbach and acts as a consistent, although progressively more sophisticated theoretical framework right through to Capital, where key elements are introduced to conceptualize it in its most developed form as a materialism of the social reproduction process. Now, this reconstructive endeavor draws heavily on the work of Mexican Ecuadorian philosopher Bolivar Echevarria, who, from the 1970s onwards, emphasized and sought to elaborate upon the originality and richness of Marx's discourse on materialism and its centrality, however textually implicit, to Marx's later work. In addition to its more general scope and effects, this account of materialism acts as the key theoretical mediation between the philosophical accounts of subsumption presented by Kant and Hegel and what is normally considered to be a strictly socioeconomic theory of subsumption under capital outlined by Marx in his mature works. Whilst the turn to human practice and history ostensibly represents a break, right, with the limitations of philosophical discourse, it is crucial to note that this occurs, at least in part, as a critique of and through the categories of that discourse, which are not thereby jettisoned altogether, but rather refunctioned, as Hans Georg Backhaus argued. Quote, upon examination of the Marxian conception, already at first sight, it becomes visible that it's based on a large number of refunctioned conceptual pairs and problems of philosophical provenance. Yet two complexes of problems dominate. On the one hand, the problem of universals, i.e., the problem of the synthesis between the general and the particular, or the individual, respectively. On the other hand, the subject-object problem, subject-object problem. Moreover, there are the relations between being and semblance, essence and appearance, being and significance, being and becoming, substance and relation, premise and result, act and entity, concept and existence, footnote 2, close quote. We can identify a persistent relevance of the central problem and motifs of subsumption developed at a philosophical level, form-determination, compositional totality, reciprocity, and subjectivity to their new theoretical context. That is, the real life of social humanity and the subsumption of individuals under social production. Thus, in contrast to interpretations which emphasize an alleged break between an early humanist Marx and a late scientific or economic Marx, our focus on the status of the key conceptual coordinates of the problem of subsumption enables us to pursue a coherent line of thinking that not only relates Marx's early critique of philosophy to his critique of political economy, but also connects the latter, that is, political economy, back to the critique of philosophy. This exploration of its underlying conceptual structure and premises allows for a richer theorization of what is at stake in capitalist subsumption than in Marx's own cursory treatment of this problem. Two principal questions emerge as we survey this line of development from philosophy to Marx's materialism. The first is, what kind of logic is employed by Marx's material critique? And what is the logical structure of that critique? Footnote 3. The second principal question is, how is the very idea of logic itself transformed, quote, as we pass from the problem of knowledge where Kant and Hegel principally situated and treated it to the problems linked with the constitutive and constituent phenomena of social reality resulting from dynamic and complex capitalist social relations. Footnote 4. The footnote 4 relates to an article, a book by Castillo Mendoza of 2002. The relation between these two questions and what ultimately establishes the condition of intelligibility for them both turns on Marx's understanding of history and the dialectical interpenetration of thought and being it stipulates. It is the introduction of historical openness that explodes the theoretical closure of totality, which in Kant and Hegel's philosophies overdetermine the relations between subjective activity, actuality, and form. Now, by grasping this relation as natural history, natural-history, and in its processual realization as reproduction-development, reproduction-development, Marx's materialism develops an entirely new perspective on the problem of subsumption that is able to grasp it, entirely new perspective on the problem of subsumption that is able to grasp it as operative beyond a strictly ideal context, namely as subsumption to social forms. See, something's happened. Section 1. Critical beginnings, page 63. In a condensed but illuminating set of introductory notes on the subsumption of labor under capital, Carlos Castillo Mendoza identifies the first of three periods in which the concept of subsumption is used by Marx as the one coinciding with his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right in 1843. Here, subsumption appears as a logical operation with which Hegel conceals a political operation. Footnote 5. If apparently immediate forms of logical identity were criticized by Kant and Hegel to reveal active processes of synthesis, mediation, and form determination, then this much is also true of Marx's earliest use of subsumption. But where Kant and Hegel discovered further subjective processes and ideal relations subtending the subsumption of particulars under universals, thereby deepening and enriching the philosophical logics they employed, the radicality of Marx's orientation consists in the fact that he critically exposed beneath an apparently harmonic subsumption was not further philosophical mediations, but pertained to a political dimension and real, that is, non-ideal processes. At its most profound level, this indicates an entirely new articulation of logical relations with social being that signals the development of Marx's materialism as an original theoretical standpoint. In its initial form, established in Marx's writings from 1844 onwards, this theoretical orientation is already grounded in a new plane of engagement that marks a shift beyond the critique of philosophy to the critique of social reality, a new object for theory, a new sphere of actuality that at the same time assigns to theory a new role and concomitantly introduces an entirely new mode of conceptualizing what a subsumptive process entails, of what, by what, under what. Insofar as the conceptual focus guiding Marx's form retains from Kant and Hegel's work the centrality of the question of form determination, that is, form-determination, it differs from those previous philosophies as to the ultimate grounds from which this act originates, and as a consequence, its adequate theoretical expression, that is, revolutionary, practical, historical materialism. Crucial in engendering this theoretical reorientation was the inescapable historical need, in the wake of Hegel's thought, for post-Hegelian philosophies to take up positions, affirmative, revisionist, or critical, in relation to the total system, a system marked, as we've seen, by the structure of speculative closure. The debates that arose in this context centered primarily on the problem of the relation of the system to the existing world. The Europe of the 1830s to 40s, and above all else, turned on the question of how to interpret Hegel's famous double dictum from the philosophy of right that What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. Footnote 6. While the self-sufficiency and completeness, that is, the rationality of Hegel's philosophy, might have been acknowledged at a theoretical level qua philosophy, the left and young Hegelian critics that followed in his wake nonetheless perceived an inadequacy in its actuality, the Wirklichkeit, and contending that the rational was not yet actual in world historical terms, claimed that there was still a need for its actualization or realization, both alternate renderings of Verwirklichung. The divergent positions within post-Hegelian thought therefore split on the basis of how they conceived of the unity or disunity of the rational and the actual, and of the philosophical and political implications that followed from their assessment of that relationship, which is to say, they differed over how, if it was indeed deemed necessary, this realization was to be undertaken. Such differences were not merely the product of divergent political applications of an uncontested Hegelian philosophy, but had their basis in fundamentally conflicting interpretations of the system as a whole. As Emmanuel Renaud points out, quote, the right conceived of realization as Realisterung through the model of the transition of the science of logic, the science of the logic, into the philosophy of nature. On the contrary, the left conceived of realization as Verwirklichung through the model of the realization of freedom in the world historical process. So, according to left Hegelian interpretation of the double dictum, contemporary culture and society was not yet rational, but still in a process of rationalization. Footnote 7. Close quote. It's from Renaud's 2012 text. What would it mean for the rational to be actual? Or, as the right Hegelians claimed, but the left Hegelians disputed, for the system to have been realized? For Hegel, actuality indicates not simply that something is, actuality is not mere existence, but that it is, in the highest sense, as free, self-subsistent existence, the unity of particularity and universality, or essence and existence. In it, formless essence and unstable appearance, or mere subsistence devoid of all determination and unstable manifoldness, have their truth. Footnote 8. Something, therefore, attains actuality for Hegel, much as Aristotle, through the manifestation of its inner essence in an outer existence, in particularizing itself in a determinate material content, actualizing its potentiality. Quote, that which exists for itself only is a possibility, a potentiality, but has not yet emerged into existence. A second element must be introduced in order to produce actuality, vis-a-vis actuation, realization, and whose motive power is the will, the activity of man in the widest sense. Footnote 9. Close quote. Hegel expresses this idea of actualization through externalization most forcefully in the science of logic. In the lapidary formulation, what is actual can act, was ist kann wirken, going on to qualify the act in terms of its power to produce systemic effects. Quote, something manifests its actuality through that which it produces, footnote 10, close quote. This production, finally, proves the actuality of a being insofar as it manifests itself outwardly in an other that nonetheless remains identical with it. A relation Hegel describes in the Phenomenology of Spirit as pure self-recognition in absolute otherness. This production, finally, proves the actuality of a being insofar as it manifests itself outwardly in an other that nonetheless remains identical with it, a relation Hegel describes in the phenomenology of spirit as pure self-recognition in absolute otherness, rendering this other a moment of its self-expression, its freedom. That is, what is actual can preserve itself in otherness. That is, it can objectify itself. Close quote, footnote 11. This unity of inner and outer constitutes a self-subsistent totality, a singular composition that encompasses all of its various determinations within itself. Actuality is therefore always the product of a dialectical process that totalizes its constituent conditions, the multiplicity of determinations through which it passes or is made up of. As Beatrice Longinus states, actuality is not something that is ontologically given, but the ultimate moment of reflection. It is a result rather than a starting point. This is crucial to our investigation because it is one of the foundational speculative principles that Marx would come to overturn. Footnote 12. Yet for Hegel, actuality is not only this result taken in isolation, it is also the process, the activity of the system itself in and as each of these determinations. Actuality is self-movement. Footnote 13. The actual is thus the truth of the dialectical whole in its various moments of posited particularity. This is why Hegel associates it with both the idea and living spirit, that which is not an essence that is already finished and complete before its manifestation, keeping itself aloof behind its host of appearances, but an essence which is truly actual only through the specific forms of its necessary self-manifestation. Footnote 14. For the system of speculative philosophy to be actual, then, its inner rationality, its freedom, would have to be proven outwardly in and as a forming and ordering of the substance of world spirit. It would have to have actualized itself, to have made the world rational and itself worldly by subsuming or sublating the irrational elements of external existence to its comprehensive order of being. Repudiating the accomplishment of this theoretically described unification of the ideal and existent, and thus contending that the project of actualization was still underway, left Hegelianism asserted that philosophy had an active rather than contemplative role to play in this process. It bore the ongoing task of criticizing the irrational aspects of the contemporary world whilst highlighting its rational dimensions, thereby guiding the course of its historical progression. However, from the perspective of young Hegelians such as Ruge, Feuerbach, Bauer, and Marx, this left Hegelian posture was insufficiently radical, for although it contested speculative rationality's actuality, it remained largely committed to the methodology and objectives of the Hegelian system as a whole, departing only from the Hegelian right and asserting the need and demanding its immediate application. Footnote 15. The young Hegelians interpreted such demands as an accommodation to the system's structural irrationality, which they sought to break free from altogether. They declared, in Ruge's words, a war of liberation against the limitations of the system. Footnote 16. These limitations were first and foremost those of speculation, and the project of overcoming them marked the beginning of a genuinely post-Hegelian theoretical discourse. Post-Hegelian discourse that attempted to undermine the systematic self-sufficiency of philosophy. Footnote 17. In theoretical terms, this implied challenging not only the degree of actuality which the system could be said to possess, but also the idealist methodology that determined the measure of that actuality itself. This challenge called into question what precisely the inward essence to be actualized and the outwardness that could register such actualization consisted in, the former as the active subject and the latter as the passive substance that was acted upon or subsumed. Footnote 18. There's a lot there. The kernel of this criticism, in which the first aspects of a practical materialist outlook can be discerned, takes issue with the fact that actuality, as conceived by speculative idealism, determines the quality of outer objectivity on the basis of its correspondence to an inner rationality, the concept, in a manner that leaves little room for comprehending the being of living, i.e., existent individuals beyond their status as bearers or predicates. For Feuerbach of Philosophical World Spirit, footnote 19, if for the idealist discourse that culminates in Hegel's work, the critical comprehension of actuality is not simply a theoretical problem, then it nevertheless, as Marx and the young Hegelians perceived it, fails to transcend the limits of an ideally registered process, to which objective being, which includes crucially human life in its natural form, stands in more or less adequate correspondence, an inevitable fate given that its essence is something other than itself. Footnote 20. The need for a subjective will to prove its actuality through the objective manifestations of its actions, so central to Hegel's thought, has meaning only in an ideal sense here, because such objectification can only be recognized as the positing of conceptual determinations that characterizes the basic mode of actualization on the speculative plane. In this sense, true knowledge, that is Kant, or rational actuality, Hegel, is delimited by the formative activity of a subject upon the mute matter that it thereby legitimates as properly objective or rational, in distinction to the representationally phantasmic or merely existence which lacks actuality. This implies a unilateral arbitration of the worldly by the intellectual, or of reality by philosophy, as Marx would claim, a selection from amongst the empirically present, which singles out that sector of the object or of activity admitted to the rational order, distinguishing it from that to be reformed and that to be neutralized or abolished. Indeed, this process of selection, negation, and formation within a subjective totality is exactly what subsumption, taken in its critical sense, involves. As an act, subsumption indicates not simply inclusion under a definition, that is logical predication, but subsumption under a function of the subject by means of which both the subject and subsumed entity are reciprocally, although unevenly, constituted. Subsumption under a function of the subject by means of which both the subject and subsumed entity are reciprocally, although unevenly, constituted. The distinctly post-Hegelian problematic raised by these criticisms supersedes the question of how it is that philosophical consciousness can, or should, comprehend the relation between its own rationality and the existent world, whether positively or negatively, and instead contests the adequacy of both this rationality, the speculative logic, and this relation, that is philosophical comprehension, to the task of making the real truly rational. Now, this shift leads beyond the question of the authoritative legislation of philosophy over the actual, as Paul Marshall Schaefer argues, quote, the basis of Marx's evaluation is that Hegel does not demonstrate the rationality of the real, as he claims in the preface, but is methodologically restricted to developing the rationality of the ideal in the form of the real. The method of speculative idealism, in other words, leads only to the illusion of substantiality, for it is incapable of grasping reality in terms other than those offered by its own logic. Consequently, every form of reality, whether natural, moral, political, or historical, is subsumed to the determinations of speculative logic. Footnote 21, close quote. Breaking with Hegelianism, then, means decoupling actuality from a philosophical ideal to which the movement of the existing world can only ever correspond to as a manifestation or derivative. Quote, since abstract thought is the essence, that which is external to it is in essence something merely external, a defective being. Close quote, footnote 22. In prioritizing the ideal aspect of development as the actuality of all processes, Hegel had slipped back into the transcendence and one-sidedness he claimed to have overcome. Shattering the speculative closure of the idealist system was thus for Marx the condition for developing simultaneously an autonomous logic of actuality and an immanent critique of its irrationality that would not be determined by correspondence to philosophical reason and which would treat outer objectivity as equally essential to the constitution of the actual as its inner subjective structure. But the criticism leveled here does not only apply to Hegelian philosophy, it places the valence of philosophical discourse as such into question and marks the beginning of a period of intense critical engagement, during which Marx, along with Engels, attempts to settle accounts with philosophy, asserting that with the exposition of actuality, self-sufficient philosophy, selbstständige philosophy, loses its medium of existence, footnote 23, close quote. But what is the content of this alternative conception of reality? What is it, if not the idea that is in the process of actualization and determines the rational content against which reality must be measured? Initially, for Marx, following Feuerbach, it is a human reality constituted in a human community. In negating what he and Engels would later dismiss as philosophical illusions of the sovereignty of general conceptions, Marx took up and developed the idea of an inversion of subject and predicate formulated by Feuerbach in his critique of religion. Quote, the exchange of that which determines or that which is determined, whose consequence is that real man and real nature become mere predicates, symbols of this hidden, unreal man and his unreal nature, close quote, footnote 24. Against this idealist conceit, it would not be the life of the idea, but the life of real humanity in its relationship to real nature that actualizes itself in the world historical process, such that the former has to be grasped as an effect of the latter. By contrast, measuring the being of man against the purity of reason or the idea was for Marx a defining characteristic of the mystifying philosophical-theological worldview that blocked the way to a genuine comprehension of real human conditions, and by proxy, in light of this actual irrationality, their revolutionary transformation. However, deconstructing the fantastic realization offered by religious consciousness with which Feuerbach was primarily concerned was only the first stage of Marx's program, and most importantly functioned as a precondition for developing a far more radical criticism of the earth, of the really existing political and ultimately socioeconomic forms of human existence. Initially, well, let's just stop there for the moment. We're at page 70, and we will trundle on more tomorrow, looking at the actuality of practice, which the meat of the matter, as they say. I think we should be able to get to page 80, perhaps. Okay, in chapter 2, we shall get through the next section to probably theory of practice and the practice of theory. See, we're getting there. We're getting to, questions that this idea of processual actuality, all of these things that are more fully articulated in Marx's treatment of those matters which, in terms of, Hegelian, were very fashionable, but never achieved a kind of conclusion or a implementation or its true social relation. I think it is this religious this question of the religion addressed by Feuerbach, et cetera, that obviously is important for some people and clearly satisfies some people as some bizarre version of rationality, which is not. But we can see where that's sort of headed. So anyway, I'm going to stop here. Close the live stream and then bring us back and close the share. And let me thank you for your attention. Hey,